all here. Welcome to the latest sessions for the California Library Association's Ursula Meyer Advocacy Fund Training. If you can all say that in one breath, you passed the midterm exam and you're part of us. We're starting off with this slide so that those of you who are new to our program can get some background. And also, we record these and we post them on the California Library Association YouTube channel. So if you like what you see here, you can go back to it. There are well over 18 other sessions already there. So spread the word. We're doing this not only for these live sessions, but to create resources for advocates in appreciation for what the Ursula Meyer Fund is all about. I'm going to stop talking for about 30 seconds, read the slide. When it goes down, we're going right to Theresa. If anybody didn't have time to read it all, you can just put it on pause when you watch the archive version. And I'm going to take that down now and say, welcome, Theresa from Freedom. I'm messing up your name already. Tell the organization name so I don't blow it on the recording. Here we are, Let Freedom Read, Freedom to Read Foundation. Theresa, you're on.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm happy to be here. Darla mentioned a few moments ago the situation in the Huntington Beach and Fresno County in California, which are two resolutions or schemes to try to restrict access to material for children in the libraries. They're both public library systems. And I will tell you a little bit more about those and what the arguments are for why they're unconstitutional. But I wanted to start initially by just giving a little bit of primer, a little bit of background on the First Amendment and some of the cases that have already been decided, which I think are very helpful in pushing back against what's happening in situations like Huntington Beach and also Fresno County. So moving on to the first slide, just a little bit of a reminder that we'll be talking about basic legal concepts here, but I can't really provide legal advice since I'm not in a position ethically to represent anyone specifically, but I hope that these cases that I'll discuss will provide you with the legal tools that you can use to talk with your own legal counsel if situations come up in your own library systems. So moving on to the next slide, I like to start off when I do a presentation on the cases in the First Amendment with actually looking at the language of the First Amendment. The First Amendment states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And that applies to the states through the 14th Amendment. But I think what's important to note is that we start with the concept that all speech is protected. And it is only unprotected if the Supreme Court has found that it's a category that doesn't deserve that kind of protection. And I'll talk about a few of those categories today. But I think it's important to note that what the Constitution starts off with is all speech is protected unless the court says it is not. And it's important to note that the First Amendment applies to adults as well as minors, that it protects the right to speak as well as the right to receive information. And again, it applies to all speech unless it's specifically been designated an unprotected category speech. And another one that's often overlooked is that the First Amendment only applies to government entities, not private entities. So when I'm talking today about libraries or schools, I'm talking about public schools and public libraries. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to start off with, where does this protection for minors come from the First Amendment? And the Tinker case, which I have up on the slide, is a really important case, the first seminal case where the Supreme Court held that minors do have First Amendment rights. In that case, Mary Beth Tinker and her brother were opposed to the Vietnam War, and they wore black armbands to school as a visible sign of their lack of support for what was happening in Vietnam. And they were disciplined for that. And they took the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And the court in that case said that students retain their First Amendment rights, even in the school setting, and that they could be disciplined only if their speech created a substantial disruption to the school. And because wearing the armbands did not do that, it was simply a symbol of what they felt and what they thought, they could not be disciplined for that. In a Board of Education v. Pico, the court addressed this issue in the context of a school library where books had been removed, and reiterated again that minors do have First Amendment rights in that context. And I do add the Mahoney case here because I think it's important to show that the Supreme Court addressed this issue very recently in 2021, and in an 8-1 decision, again, upheld the rights of minors and their free speech rights. In this case, a cheerleader actually was disappointed to find out that she had not made the varsity team, and while off campus, sent a Snapchat, which was quite vulgar, and showed her disappointment against her coach and her team. That was captured, photograph, screenshot, and it reached the coach, who then suspended her completely from the team at all. So she wasn't just not going to be on the varsity team, but she wasn't going to be on the JV team at all. And she also took that, challenged that disciplinary action and took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And again, the court in an 8-1 decision found that their minors do have First Amendment rights, and also that the reach of school officials to discipline actions outside of campus could only be limited to actual instances of bullying, threats against the school, or anything related to schoolwork that might have occurred if that happened off campus using school computers, for example. But the court reiterated again that even though the speech might have been vulgar, it was still protected speech. And even though it was by a minor, it was still protected speech. And specifically, I like to talk about Justice Alito, who I think is one of the most conservative judges on the court, but has been quite supportive of First Amendment rights. And I will give you his quote. He said, "Public school students, like all other Americans, have the right to express unpopular ideas on public issues." And I think the same is true for receiving ideas. So there may be unpopular books that some find offensive that are in libraries, but minors have a right to have access to those materials. So moving on to the next slide, I did mention unprotected categories of speech. And what we've seen in recent challenges is folks going to school board meetings, to public board meetings, or filing challenges in which they're accusing the librarians of having materials that are obscene, or they call it pornography, and saying that because they're obscene, they need to be removed. But what we found is that folks don't really understand what legally those terms mean. And obscenity, which is an unprotected category of speech, was defined by the Supreme Court in the Miller v. California case. And there are 3 parts to the test: whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as specifically defined by an applicable state law, whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work as a whole appeals to the prurient interests, and third, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And there are some important notes to make here. First, the material would have to meet all 3 parts of the test in order to actually be found to be obscene. And only a court can find material to be obscene. So the fact that someone comes into a board meeting and says, "This is obscene, you have to remove it," does not mean that that board or anyone else can actually make the determination that the material, in fact, is obscene. And while the first 2 parts of the test usually are applying contemporary community standards of a particular community, it's important to note that the 3rd part of the test, what we call the serious value test, the court has found to be a nationwide reasonable person standard. So if material has serious value, then it has serious value everywhere. And that's usually a determination that will be made in a court with the addition of expert testimony about what the value of the work is. I also wanted to note that in many states, there are exemptions that can be applied. While there might not be in a particular library or school staff exemption, California, for instance, has an educational scientific exception. I don't know how that has been applied by the courts, but if this situation does arise in your own community, this would be something to talk with your legal counsel to determine how the courts in California have applied exemptions specifically in library or school situations. Moving on, there is another category, moving on to the next slide, another category of speech called harmful to minors. And this is also something that is often alleged in as to why books should be removed from libraries. We've been finding the reference to harmful minors appearing in various policies and different resolutions across the country that are being introduced to govern how materials are curated for libraries. And the harmful to minors test is sometimes called obscenest to minors. sometimes harmful to juveniles. And it's important to note here that this test parallels the obscenity test that was set forth in Miller v. California. But the considerations are in the context of offensiveness and serious value for minors. And as with obscenity, it's also important to note that for harmful to minors, the material has to be examined as a whole. This is the other thing that we've seen in challenges is you will often see someone come in and they'll read one paragraph from a book and say it has to be removed because it's obscene or it's harmful to minors because of this one paragraph or maybe a couple of pages. And that's not how the obscenity or the harmful to minors test works. When a court is making that determination, they have to examine the work as a whole. So they're reviewing it as a whole. Does it have serious value? Not just removing it or finding it to be obscene or harmful because of one extract from a book or material. And the material the courts have found has to be viewed in this case from the perspective of the oldest minor. So what that means is that if you have a book, for example, that might not be something that would be applicable or something that a 5-year-old would have access to, it certainly can't be found to be harmful to minors if it would have serious value for the oldest of minors, for a 16 or a 17-year-old or a middle schooler. And just to reiterate again, only a court can make this determination. Moving on to the next slide, the final category of unprotected speech that I wanted to discuss briefly is child pornography. Another term that is often thrown around is pornography, saying we need to remove this book because it's pornographic. But pornography in and of itself is not a term that has a definition as far as criminal law. Only child pornography is an unprotected category of speech and something that can be criminalized. And in the New York v. Ferber case, the court found that child pornography is defined as visual depictions of actual children engaged in actual sexual activity. And the purpose here is to prevent the exploitation of actual children. And importantly, visual depictions, which in Ashcroft, the court further said that Ferber would not extend to virtual depictions. So it would also not extend to, for example, an adult portraying a minor in a film. That would not constitute child pornography. So the important takeaway from this is that when we're talking about child pornography, it's actually the exploitation of actual children. So there's no serious value test. Community standards don't matter here. You don't evaluate materials as a whole. If an actual child is being exploited by being depicted, engaged in sexual activity, then it meets the definition of child pornography. It's unprotected speech and it can be criminalized. But pornography, just the term pornography by itself, does not equal obscenity or child pornography, nor does something being sexually explicit mean that it would meet the definition of either obscenity, harmful to minors, or child pornography. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk briefly about the different tests that apply in terms of book removals in a school library context versus book removals in the context of a public library. So first, to address school libraries. I mentioned the Board of Education v. Pico case earlier. This was a case, a high school, where books were removed from the library and a lawsuit was brought to challenge the removal of those books. And the court found that there is a First Amendment right to receive information and that minors have that right, and that school officials cannot remove books from a school library simply because they disagree with the viewpoint of the books. And that is a fact question for the court to decide. So obscenity is not the test in school cases. In the context of school cases, the Board of Education v. Pico court held that the question is whether the books are educationally unsuitable or if they're pervasively vulgar, although that term has never really been defined by any court. So we're basically asking the question, were the books removed because they were educationally unsuitable, or did the school board or a superintendent or a school official remove the book because they disagreed with the content or the viewpoint of the books? And that's the test. If they removed it because they disagree with the viewpoint or the content, then it's unconstitutional. And just a few other cases that have dealt with these issues, just to give you access to that if you needed it, if you were facing your own challenge. One important thing, the case the Unified School District held, this was a challenge to Annie on My Mind, and the book was removed. And the court found there that because they disregarded their own procedures by removing the book, they didn't follow the procedures for review that they had, that was evidence of unconstitutional motivation and showed that they were not doing it because they thought the book was educationally unsuitable. And I think it also came out in that case that the school officials who voted to remove the book hadn't even read the whole book. Again, pointing out how important it is, even if we're not talking about obscenity, that it is important to have that information. And did the officials who removed the book do it based on an excerpt or by being told that somebody thought it was offensive? Or are they really looking at the book as a whole and evaluating it for educational suitability? In the Campbell case, the books that was targeted was a book called Voodoo and Hoodoo. And the court found that whether the unconstitutional motivation was there is a question that should be determined by a judge or jury as a fact question. So there would have to be some discovery. And that's why it's important, if you have challenges come up, to document those cases. Document what officials or board members are saying when they're asking for the book to be removed or voting for it to be removed. Are they saying they're doing it because it's offensive, because it talks about a certain topic? Those are all things to document, because those would be important for any future litigation that would come up in order to show that school officials were acting in an unconstitutional manner and engaging in the removal based on their own disagreement with the viewpoint of the book. A more recent case in Missouri challenged the removal of 8 different books. 7 of those were eventually returned to the shelves, and so the case was not appealed. In that case, there was a request for a preliminary injunction. And what that means is, in these cases, and I'll mention that term again a couple of times, initially when we have a First Amendment case that's challenging removal of materials, the plaintiffs who bring the case will ask the court to make a preliminary examination and enter an injunction that would require the books to stay on the shelves or the material to stay in the library while the case is pending. In this case, the judge denied that preliminary injunction and said that the books were not banned because they were still available at a public library or a bookstore. And I think that this is the wrong legal result. I think this flies contrary to what the U.S. Supreme Court has held in other cases. If you think back on the Tinker case that I mentioned, the court could easily have said, look, Mary Beth, you might protest the Vietnam War, but you don't have to do it at school. You can do it outside of school. Take your armband off as you're coming into school and put it back on as you're getting off the bus at the end of the day. But that's not what the court held. The court held that minors have those rights and they have them in the school context. So I do think that the judge was wrong in this case, and that it's inconsistent with other Supreme Court cases. But I mention it as a case that is out there, and that this is sometimes an argument that is made when these cases come up in the school library context. So moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about public libraries and book removal. In the public library context, there is less discretion about removing materials because we're talking about a public library. So there isn't the same sort of educational suitability argument that can be made in this context. And what we've seen in these cases are sometimes outright removals, sometimes removals from a children's section to an adult section, and different ways of trying to segregate materials away from minors. The Sun case in Texas was a case where the Wichita Falls passed an ordinance which would have allowed 300 members of the community to sign a petition that would go to the library, and the petition would be asking books to be removed from the children's section and placed on restricted shelves in the adult section of the library. And they did get those petitions for 2 books, Daddy's Roommate and Heather Has 2 Mommies, and they forced the removal of those books, and that was challenged. And the court found that that removal was unconstitutional, even though the books weren't removed entirely from the library. Just the fact that they were taken out of the children's section where children and their parents who were browsing couldn't come across them while they're browsing in the library, that was enough because it was a significant burden on their First Amendment rights. And interestingly, because we've also heard a lot of folks arguing that these book removals have to take place because of parents' rights. Parents have the rights to make sure that their children don't have access to certain books at the library. And that argument was made in 2000, back in 2000, in the Sun case, and the court completely rejected that argument, saying that parents have the right to accompany their own children to the library and to make book selections for their own children, but they did not have the right to impose their views on the wider community and on all the parents and children in the community. So that's been an important case that we've been able to cite in many of the recent cases as well. A more recent case is from Texas, the Lila Green versus Llano County case. This is a case in which numerous books were removed at the behest of board members who basically kept pushing at the librarian to remove the books, and they were removed. There were 17 that were highlighted, including books with race and LGBTQ themes, and even picture books like In the Night Kitchen by Maurice Sendak. They also, for a short time, actually stopped access to their entire digital collection, which consisted of over 17,000 digital materials, simply because there were 2 books in that collection that they did not think should be available for the public. They eventually replaced it with a different collection, and so they did get back their digital access. But the court in that case did grant a preliminary injunction that was requested, and said that the books physical books had to be returned to the catalog because they had been removed because of viewpoint discrimination. They had tried for a time to argue that the books were actually still on the premises and the plaintiffs all knew about them, so they could ask for them so that there was no actual case, the case was moot. And the court rejected that argument as well, finding that books can't be held in a hidden library, that's unconstitutional and burdens the First Amendment rights of the patrons. The court rejected the argument that there was no violation because patrons could still get the books online or through interlibrary loan. And finally, they had argued that the removal was just part of a weeding process. And the court said that weeding is okay if it's objective criteria that's being used, but not where here it was based on viewpoint, not agreeing with the viewpoint. This is a case that was appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and Freedom to Read Foundation joined the American Library Association, the Texas Library Association, in filing an amicus brief in that case, where we argued that the professional standards and the ethical canons that govern librarians in the selection of collection materials are important to consider. We wanted the court to understand how selections are made, and that the ethical canons of professional librarians do not allow them to use viewpoint discrimination in making decisions. And to explain how weeding should work, that weeding should use objective criteria, and also to make the point that the judge had made that a hidden library violates the fundamental concept of how a library functions for the community. Another case that we've been involved in is a case in Arkansas. This is a case where the state statute expanded the harmful to minors statute that they already had to make it a crime to make available materials or to present materials. And this is so obviously broad and vague that basically, if there had ever been a finding that a book was harmful and it was in the library, librarians could have been prosecuted for that, even though obviously librarians can't read every single possible book that's in a library or anticipate what a court down the road might find to be harmful. So that was challenged on the ground that that part of it was overbroad. But what this statute also did is set up a procedure that would allow for outside the criminal court, but as a sort of a civil matter, would allow any person affected, which was the definition, by a book being in the library, a public library, to challenge it on the basis that it was inappropriate and that it should be moved to an inaccessible area. Well, again, the standard of appropriateness is so vague and clearly would allow for just that kind of viewpoint discrimination that the courts have found to be unconstitutional. So that the court there also granted a preliminary injunction saying that it violated both adults and minors, and that it was impossible to really have adults only sections in public libraries, which would be stigmatizing for folks that wanted access to those books. So moving on to the next slide, I did want to talk about parental permission requirements, because that's what we're seeing in Huntington Beach and in Fresno County, California. In both of those resolutions, and the Huntington County resolution was passed. In Huntington County, parental permission is required for, quote, any content of a sexual nature, end quote. Very broad, very vague. And it also, Huntington Beach, I keep saying county, I'm sorry, it's city of Huntington Beach, also created the resolution would create a board that would be appointed by city council members, so by a political board that would review any books that are already in the library or any books that would be purchased for the library based on community standards. Again, a very vague term. And that resolution was passed. And there was quite a bit of challenge to that resolution. Many speakers that came to speak out against it. There hasn't been a litigation filed yet, but that certainly is something that could happen just based on how many people were protesting the passing of the resolution. In Fresno County, which was just heard yesterday, and our understanding is that the resolution as proposed was not accepted, that it was amended, but I don't have all the details of that yet. But the original resolution also called for parental permission for anything with sexual content or anything that related to gender identity. It also proposed setting up a community parent and guardian review committee that again would be appointed by the county board, and that would review all challenges to books and review books that are in the library. We have seen the Counts case that I have here up on the screen is a case where we saw a parental permission scheme found to be unconstitutional. This was a case where Harry Potter books in a high school library were placed on a restricted shelf and could only be accessed by parental permission. And the court found that to be unconstitutional because the authorities, school authorities, could not demonstrate that there was any reason why those books had to be restricted based on educational suitability, or as they claimed that they would create a disruptive environment in the school. And the court found that no high school student should have to go through the process of going to a restricted shelf, getting parental permission, if there was no justification for the book being placed on a separate restricted shelf. So just very briefly, so that we have enough time for questions. Moving to the next slide, I wanted to just make you aware of another case in Texas, which requires book ratings. In this case, the statute requires vendors to label their own books. So that would be bookstores, publishers, authors who might be selling the books. Any book that they would want to sell to a school library in Texas, they have to label. They could, it can be sold without any restrictions if it's unrated. But if they rate it sexually explicit, then the schools cannot purchase it for a school library. If they rate it sexually relevant, then it can be purchased, but could only be taken out by a student with parental permission and only to be viewed off campus. The Texas Education Commission can override or require a different label. Those findings would then be placed on the Texas Education Association website. So the impact of book purchases could go beyond Texas school libraries because they're compelling these vendors to rate their own books. The court in this case also granted a preliminary injunction, finding that those terms were vague and that was an unconstitutionally compelling speech by the vendors. But Freedom to Read Foundation was involved at the district court level and amicus to talk about the harms to students by having these kind of restrictions on purchases for school libraries in Texas. And we're planning to file an amicus brief later this week or later this month with the Fifth Circuit that again talks about the harm to students, but also once again tries to educate the court about how school librarians curate their collections for school libraries and how they want to present students with a diversity of viewpoints and content and materials in the school library setting, which is different than the curriculum setting where school authorities have broad discretion. So I'll Move on to the next slide, just to say that there are current book removal cases across the country, a high school case in South Carolina, elementary school case in Lake County, Florida, where the picture book And Tango Makes Three was removed. In Escambia County, there were over 150 books removed, but that's also been challenged in a lawsuit. Crawford County, Arkansas is one of those cases where even before the statute that I mentioned earlier was passed, Crawford County took all of their LGBTQ materials from all parts of their library, including the children's and young adult section, and placed them all in a restricted adults only area. And then there's another public library challenge for books, again, LGBTQ themed books being removed from a public. So I'll move on to the next slide and open it up for questions.
Theresa, thank you so much. Theresa, thank you so much for doing that. That really gives us, I think, a lot of food for thought, obviously. But tell me if I'm wrong on this. Isn't there a lot of encouragement in the idea that a lot of us are getting blasted by people saying, you've got to do this? And what you're saying is there is a lot of reasonable room for us to respond to that without just having to bow to the first person that yells at us loudly. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I think what we've seen often is that the sort of loudest voice in the room are folks that are trying to get books removed. And sometimes school authorities just want to avoid the controversy and will react. And they react by removing the books. But I think that there are great ways to respond. I think Joyce may have talked about that in the last session, and can give us more information about that. But Unite Against Book Bans provides great information for advocacy, for on-the-ground efforts to organize parents and students and community members to push back against any of these kinds of restrictions or proposals or resolutions. As a last resort, litigation is a last resort. You want to solve the problem before it gets to litigation. But I do talk about all these cases because I think it's important to know that, by and large, we had one result that was not a great one at a preliminary injunction stage that I mentioned in Missouri, but courts are getting it. We've had great decisions. I think the Arkansas case that I mentioned particularly, the judge spent a large part of his opinion talking about the important work that librarians do and how librarians, the function that libraries play and that librarians play in providing materials, and historically the importance of libraries to a community. So I think we're finding that the judges are getting it. And even though we don't want litigation to be, where we go, it takes years, it takes a long time, it takes a lot of money and effort. I think that as we get those cases, we can use those to push back in these for more local challenges.
Thank you so much. Let's go to Amrit, who's got her hand up. Question from you, Amrit?
Hi, yes, thank you, Theresa. That was extremely thorough and fantastic. Two questions. The cases that are being appealed to the Fifth and Eighth Circuit, do they have published opinions yet? And then the second question is, we've received the information on the number of book ban challenges this year from ALA. Are you noticing an increase around election years and kind of political stunts?
I'll answer the first question. Those appeals are still pending. So there are published decisions from the district courts, and the information that provided on the slide would, I think, help you to find those because they're out on the internet. And we certainly have been using those cases already to cite them to, in opposition to other efforts to remove materials. But the appeals themselves are still pending in those cases. On the second question, yes, I think that we certainly have seen efforts to have sort of school board members or public library board members thrown off and others come in who might support book banning. So I do think that there have been some, as you called them, stunts of folks trying to have book removals and doing it in a very public way to get support for their own viewpoints. So I don't know if that means, now that we've had the election, whether that will slow down or not, or whether it'll just be efforts to sort of ramp up for the next set of elections. But that's something we'll have to keep an eye out for. But we
I mean,
did
does
see
that
some
answer
good
your-
results yesterday as far as there were several communities where Moms for Liberty were pushing candidates and they did not win their elections. So some hope.
Marie, did that answer your questions? And do you have any other follow-ups?
Absolutely, that was great. And just, if there's something law libraries can do to support amicus briefs, I hope you'll let us know.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to chat. While you were talking, Theresa, Darla put in a brief update on the Fresno situation you were talking about. Darla, do you care to unmute yourself and give us a recap of what you know from what happened yesterday?
From my understanding, it's coming back for final approval with these two primary changes, which are they wanted a smaller committee, and they also one of the board members who was going to vote against it asked for a list of books that they've reviewed and if they were moved out of the children's section and what they were. And then that's why he voted yes, was because they made those small changes. So this will be coming back, and they are trying to gather their troops right now to try to approach that. A lot of people came out against it, and they still passed it. So.
For those people that are watching the archive version, Darla, you've got a great question in chat. Do you just want to pose that directly to Theresa?
That's fine. I'm trying. Do you have recommendations on how to work with your governing boards and legal councils to get ahead of this? I really like to do that whenever possible. So I would rather not wait till somebody comes out of the woodwork and starts rallying these type of things. So.
Sure. There were a number of letters that were filed in both Huntington County, I always say county, I'm sorry, the Huntington Beach and also in Fresno that, for example, Freedom to Read Foundation joined letters that were filed by the ACLU and the First Amendment Coalition, which I think do set forth very in specific detail why those resolutions are unconstitutional. And that would be something that you could bring to your council ahead of any action that might be happening in your own county to try to educate local council on the First Amendment issues that are involved and why that you're setting yourself up for a lawsuit by passing a similar resolution, which I think is true. I think that we're seeing more community folks who's standing up and pushing back against these types of resolutions. And I think that there is a fiduciary responsibility that any board should consider, that by adopting these kind of resolutions, they are subjecting themselves to a high risk of litigation, which is costly. It has cost more than $200,000 for Llano County, Texas, as has been reported already, to defend themselves against removing those 17 books from their library. And that case is not done.
Mm-hmm.
That's great food for thought whenever we're told, oh, I'm going to sue you. And you think, well, what's it going to cost you? Great point, Theresa. Thank you so much. Joyce put in, again, for the people watching the archive version, Joyce put in a resource saying there are a number of ways to look at what we're talking about, including one where the website is uniteagainstbookbans.org. Again, uniteagainstbookbans.org. Joyce, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I'll just note that often we realize that school librarians especially, but also public librarians, can't always be the people shouldering this. They need to have support, whether that's from fellow administrators or other staff, but most importantly, community members. And UniteAgainstBookBans.org has a challenge toolkit, suggestions for how to write letters, a wonderful talking point list so people can go to a school board meeting or a public library board meeting with talking points that are short, practical, nonpartisan, and effective. And the best thing about this advocacy tool is that if you sign up and include your zip code, if there's a situation like in Fresno, where people want to have folks turn out and be supportive, Unite Against Book Bans staff will send an e-blast saying, this is taking place, this is where it's at. Here are the talking points. please do this if you're able. So it's become a very effective tool for helping out at that level.
And here I go with my broken record thing. Every time we have one of these sessions, we always come back to the idea of Ursula Meyer's training program here is set up to help you as advocates to understand A, you are not alone. B, you have lots of resources. C, California Library Association itself is a great source of advocacy, having a committee that oversees advocacy and legislation, having a small group that works with me directly on these Ursula Meyer series that we do, reaching out to get more resources. But never forget, in those moments when you're feeling totally isolated and hammered, you have a great community. It starts right in your own backyard, extends regionally and statewide throughout California, extends through other library consortia and professional organizations like the American Library Association. You go to their websites, ALA, you go to the website of the California Library Association, you'll find plenty of advocacy tools. And those of us saying, talk to us. Tell us what we can do to help you. Tell us what we can do to help you get your chops up so that you can do the job you were hired to do and serve your community effectively. And let us, although this is not a popular thing to say these days, let's realize we're advocating from a point of view. The people that are advocating from a different point of view firmly believe that they're on the right side of the track. And as we saw in last month's session, when we were talking about what Sean Thrasher had done and what Derek Wolfgram has done when faced with really tough situations involving challenges to library materials and library programming, sometimes extending an open ear and listening, no matter how much you agree or disagree with it, goes a long way in diffusing situations. Highly recommend to those of you that are struggling with this, look back over the YouTube channel postings that we have for California Library Association. There's an updated playlist of all the sessions we've done. And there may be things in there that you and your staff can look at that will encourage you and give you ideas. So off my soapbox, back to Theresa. Anything you want to say as a wrap for what you've been talking about?
No, I've been talking too much, so it's time for
No.
others to talk, and I'm happy to answer any other questions as we go on.
All right, so let's move it right over to Kalie and to Molly, coming to us from San Lorenzo Public Library. Yay, I got the name right. In joke, folks. Yesterday in our documentation, putting this together, I had the wrong organization, so fix that. Here we are. Molly and Kalie, let's go into the trenches and talk about what you've been facing and how you've dealt with it in a positive way.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so my name is Kalie McGuirl. I'm a library technician at San Lorenzo. And over here, we've faced some pretty intense backlash for our drag story hour programming the past 2 years. And unfortunately, we're continuing to face it as well. So I'm going to tell you a bit about some of the incidents that we've had. And I also do want to emphasize that this is an ongoing story, even though the harassment has died down. So after I speak about what has happened to us, Molly's going to talk a bit about our response to it. So yeah, before I get started, a little bit about San Lorenzo. Our community is an unincorporated area in Alameda County. It is about 30,000 people in population, and it's just south of Oakland. Our library serves mainly working class and immigrant families, and our population has diverse racial backgrounds. Before June of 2022, we were pretty much unknown. We were like a very small library. In June of 2022, we hosted a drag story time. It was aggressively interrupted by a group of 8 Proud Boys, a known white supremacist group. And this incident pretty much propelled us into getting a lot of attention that we didn't really want. So yeah, basically during that incident, this group of Proud Boys barged into the room after our story time had started, and they screamed slurs and insults at us, including pedophilia accusations, the T-slur, telling our performer, "You're not safe here." It was a really terrifying experience, honestly. We were also, unfortunately, pretty unprepared for it, as in the past we'd had drag storytime protesters, but they'd been fairly respectful. They'd stayed outside on the sidewalk as they're supposed to, that sort of thing. And I think that we reacted well in the moment to this challenge. We were able to get our performer to safety pretty immediately, and we escorted the families that were attending the story time to a different part of the library. After that, we basically de-escalated the situation by engaging with the disruptors and keeping things calm. The sheriff's office ended up arriving and escorting them out. We were able to finish the story time, but it was a really scary incident. I think everyone is very shaken up by it. And it also thrust us onto the news. We got harassing phone calls, comments, just so much media attention for months afterwards. And also because of this attention, this past year, last June, we also had a drag story time interrupted by protesters. The story time we were a little bit more prepared for, but it was still pretty thoroughly disrupted by a large anti-drag contingent. Disruptors ended up shoving a member of the library staff, trying to force their way into our program room. Pretty scary. And we're still currently dealing with harassment from some of the people who were disruptive then. So that's a bit about, what's been happening with us and our struggle to have these drag story times and facing public backlash. I want to turn it over to Molly to talk about a little bit about our response and strategy for dealing with that kind of public comment. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions?
Okay, I will go ahead and continue here. Thank you, Kalie, for excuse me, filling the group in here on kind of what we've been going through and how this situation has been evolving. I get to talk about a little bit more of the positive side of things that have come from this. So about our response to this goes back to the original incident last year after our drag story time in 2022 in June. We were kind of reeling. It was a very surreal kind of experience. And we found ourselves debating, okay, how are we going to respond to this? We didn't want to have something like this happen in our community and in our library and just let it go by and, return to normal without addressing it and really coming out with a strong response. We had a lot of support from the community itself once the news broke and they were talking about what happened here. We had so many people come in to us and, express sympathy and support for drag programming, for the LGBTQ community. And in fact, some of our local leadership, we had mentioned we're in an unincorporated area. So for us, it would be our local board of supervisors. They had reached out to us to offer support and also, agreed that we really wanted to send a strong message of that is not what this community is about, and that we don't tolerate people's rights being trampled upon like that. And so they said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we had an LGBTQ program, at least one every single month? They were really upset by just having 1 month of LGBTQ programming. So we said, well, let's do 12 instead. And we were very fortunate that, when we expressed, okay, we love this idea, but I don't know how feasible it is for our resources. They were able to be very generous and give us the funding that we needed to be able to support a year of queer programming here at the library. So throughout that whole year, we did accomplish that goal. We had at least one program each month for, very visibly and specifically for the LGBTQ community. Our approach on developing this programming, it was really important to us to increase visibility and a more welcoming environment in the wake of this horrible incident. And also to give directly back to the LGBT communities. Since we were able to receive so much funding, we really wanted to continue to propel that funding forward within the community. So we kept that in mind when planning our programs and creating partnerships with folks. We also wanted to make sure that it was a really dynamic array of programs that covered every age group and every type of program, from passive things like, take-home craft kits and book displays, all the way to larger scale special events. So just to highlight some of our successes, some of our favorite programs that we did, just to give you an example of some of the things that we came up with. We had a very successful name change clinic. We were able to partner with Bay Area Legal Aid, and they served 20 trans folks in assisting them with the paperwork and the whole process of getting name and gender marker changes legally done. As I mentioned before, we had some take-home craft kits and blackout poetry kits for teens and younger children. And we also culminated the year with a Queer Comics Expo, where we had panelists and local vendors, local community resources, and local artists all coming together to just highlight the great work and expression that's being done in comics. Being able to pull off this programming was obviously not without its challenges. As Kalie mentioned, throughout the whole time that we were doing this programming, as much support as we got locally from our community, we were also still getting really upsetting phone calls and messages and things like that. People just really wanting to express their discontent with what we were doing. So that was definitely challenging. The time crunch also of a program every month was very real. And a lot of times it was a little bit at odds with the goal of long-term outreach. It takes time to build community, especially when you're working with less resourced partners, as we all know. And so trying to have that goal at the same time with the time push of pulling off these programs one after the other was a little difficult at times. Also, as Kalie mentioned, being an unincorporated area, we don't have a large, visible, centered LGBTQ demographic. We don't have an LGBTQ center or a clear established resource to just turn to directly. So we were largely building this community partnership base kind of from the ground up. Also, I want to acknowledge that while we're here in the Bay Area, liberal East Bay, San Lorenzo does have an unfortunate long legacy of being a sundown town. And there is still very much, very conservative attitudes locally here in the community. They weren't the people, for the most part, coming to disrupt the story times, but there is still that sentiment there that you can feel, and that does create a little bit of a challenge. The last thing I want to speak on will hopefully be things that are useful for you all. We've talked a lot about what our experience here at San Lorenzo has been, but I wanted to share some of the takeaways and some of the lessons that we have learned along the way here. The first thing, unfortunately, this issue is not going to be going away anytime soon. We've come to realize this is kind of the new normal landscape. And if you're going to be doing LGBTQ programming, which of course we hope you all will be, it's just something that we all need to be considering. And we need to prepare for, hopefully in advance, so that you don't get caught as off guard as we were initially. It's really important to be creative and diverse in how you incorporate your LGBTQ themes into your programming. You can be very visible and have it be huge, loud, and proud, but sometimes that's not always safe or the best option for what you're trying to achieve. So it's important to remember that you can have, just a general history program, but you make sure that you are highlighting, people from the LGBTQ community as part of that, just as an example. Be sure to offer balanced programs. Consider your resource, your safety, and the need that you are trying to address. And just be really thoughtful and work as a team to be sure that you are considering all of those things when dealing with themes of such a controversial nature these days. It's really important to start conversations about LGBTQ policies, programming, staff hiring, and retention, whatever level you are at in your organization. The conversation being started is of paramount importance, and making sure that we are connected to hiring, supporting, and retaining LGBTQ staff is so important because it makes trying to do this work a lot more difficult without that actual, tapped in community. And lastly, um, the thing that we've really realized is that safety is number one, but a strong number two behind that is building a really strong community and staying in this together. Resiliency is going to come from the community that you build, so we need to build really strong. And these folks are very organized in their efforts, and we kind of need to follow suit and be just as organized in our push as well, so that we can meet these demands. That's basically all I have. Hopefully that was useful, and we are happy to take any questions.
I love it when somebody says that's all I have, and you've just given us like 5 hours of information in about 15 minutes. Those of you that were just as bombarded as I was by that, remember there will be an archived version of this. Should be online on the YouTube channel within the next 24 to 48 hours. So if there's parts of that you want to go back to, I would encourage you. Let's all go back to that and see what we missed on the first go around so we can incorporate it in. Joyce had a question. Joyce, you just want to unmute and ask that directly of Molly and Kalie?
Sure. Well, it's a two-part. So the first part of my question, it sounds like initially community leaders said, "Here we're here to support you, and we're going to help fund you, and we want to see this become a thing." So my first question is, have they given you ongoing support and involvement, or did they just kind of say, "No, we want it to keep going, here you go"? What's been your experience?
It's been the latter for the most part. After sort of the big initial splash, it's been very much our staff here at San Lorenzo specifically doing a lot of this work and doing a lot of the real consistent carrying on of this kind of fight. It is important to note too that there has been an election and whatnot, and so there is actually, it is a different individual now who is our supervisor, so that might have something to do with it as well. Politics, things change with the times. But yeah, it was sort of a very strong initial support, and unfortunately we are a little bit more on our own now, a year out. But I do want to acknowledge that support internally from our administration, from, our director, all the way down, that support is there. And, if we need help with something internally, all we have to do is ask.
That's fantastic. And the second question, and then I'll stop talking and let everyone else ask. I want to note the importance doing any library program whatsoever, and especially programs related to LGBTQ content and others is the importance of knowing your policies. For example, you were mentioning safety, having that a plan, but also knowing meeting room capacity, reminding your staff of the patron behavior policy. Obviously, the Proud Boys were violating that. And just so when I talk about programming in libraries, especially now that we have programs and displays, et cetera, disrupted, I always note ahead of time, it's good to look at your policies, know what it says, and then know how you can respond to them and where you'll get support in that response, whether it's from your local police or fire officials or from your trustees, but who will implement these steps and reinforce them if it happens. And thank you both for your willingness to talk about this, because I know that's hard too. It's awful to go through it, and I'm impressed that you're both willing to share your story so others may have an easier time.
Thank you.
Molly and Kalie, I want to follow up on the poll quote I just put into the chat there. Molly saying, if we need help internally, all we have to do is ask. You've gone through some pretty hellish things over the last year, as have many of our colleagues across the country. Is there anything that you've seen or heard from community members that offers you hope and keeps you going in a positive way?
For me personally, even though it was hard work to pull off, the full year of programming was really healing. We sort of were reclaiming our space in our own way. And anytime we had a really successful program, it really filled that bank back up. You kind of see it just reinvigorates, why we're doing all of this and why it's important, when you see the joy and the appreciation and the real community that people come together to make in the library. Yeah, that's kind of what kept me going throughout. And just, I mean, things like this, coming together and speaking to colleagues and just having all of that support and people really acknowledging, yeah, that was a lot, and thanks for doing this. It really does help. It really does mean a lot. Did you have something to share, Kalie?
Yeah, I just wanted to share a little, I mean, responding to that question, I'll just tell a little story about uh, another drag story time that we had in February of this year, actually. So for Valentine's Day, we decided to have a drag story time. And I think because it wasn't June and we weren't sort of like getting this national level of attention from people who were invested in, disrupting events like that. We did not have any incidents, fortunately, in February, and over 65 people showed up to the event. And that, at San Lorenzo, like we're a very small library, as we mentioned. Like, I would say our normal attendance for a lot of programs is like 20 people or so, So this was like, oh wow, the community really wants this. Like the community really supports us. They're happy we're putting on this program. And for me, like that specific program was like, oh, like, we've been getting this attention and this harassment, and it's kind of coming from outside our community and it's negatively impacting us. But when you take that away, like when people aren't noticing what we're doing or they're not paying attention to it because they weren't expecting us to do one in February, you see what the actual community wants. And, it just, the amount of queer families, the amount of excited kids at that story time, it was extremely sweet and extremely healing.
Chris and Theresa, let me draw you back in with that same question. You've seen all stuff all over the country. What most encourages you from the people you work with and that you see at the community level?
Well, just that folks are fighting back. I think that we've seen various instances, a school group in Pennsylvania that fought back and they got their books back, and you see community members. I think even when you see resolutions passing in Huntington or in Fresno, and there has been support against those resolutions passing. I think that encourages the kind of litigation matters that we have seen, which have given us some of these great cases in the last few months, where judges are acknowledging that what is happening is unconstitutional. So I think that that is still important, and I think that still puts pressure on the communities. And I think just seeing, again, folks stepping up and again not allowing the loudest voices in the room to get their way, even though they're a minority, is encouraging.
Thanks, Joyce. Nothing. Okay.
I didn't have anything to add. I was just nodding in vigorous agreement.
Wonderful. Let's give a few more minutes to the people that were nice enough to join us for the session today. All of you that are out there as participants in this, what are you seeing in your communities that gives you encouragement in the face of all the challenges that we're hearing about? Anyone? Sure. See two people with a hand up. Go for it.
I can't see who the other person is.
One with a hand up. Let's go for that one.
So I'm Alyssa Ronning, and I'm from the Huntington Beach Public Library. And so I can tell you that despite the resolution from the City Council, our community is so overwhelmingly supportive of the library, and our support groups have really banded together. And there's going to be a lawsuit, and it's because of them. It's because of their support and for their vocal advocacy, for showing up at City Council meetings and expressing, they're like just how opposed they are to what the City Council has done. And so that's really, the kind of where you get the joy, because there are days that there is no joy. And so you have to, find those little moments when they, when you get a little thank you card from a patron, when you're working at the reference desk or something, and they just, give you a little card and they just want you to know how much they appreciate us. Those kind of things are really, those are really important. But the bigger important thing is what our friends groups are doing in support of us. We're at a little bit of a kind of a pause. Everybody keeps wondering what books have been banned, and right now nothing has been banned because the council hasn't defined any of the terms in the resolution. They don't have a committee yet. There's been no action. So we're just kind of like waiting to see if they're going to define a few things for us. So so we're just kind of waiting and seeing right now. And I think while we're waiting and seeing, the lawsuit is going to get probably presented fairly soon. That's the rumblings we hear anyway. So yeah, just take what your patrons and what your support groups give you, and really lean on that.
A couple of quick observations there. That what you just said ties back to what Theresa said so eloquently up front. Just because people are saying you've got to take it off the shelves, or people are screaming for book bans, doesn't mean that the stuff has been banned. It's just up to us to be that front line with our communities as positive advocates to say, folks, that's not necessarily where the entire community is. Let's see, I think it was Darla who also was going to suggest something here. Positive things you've seen in your community, how you're keeping your spirits up.
When this started raising its head last year, we had a drag story time protest that the organization that was going to do it actually canceled, and there was some backlash about them doing anything with children. I decided at that time to do the Banned Book Week resolution, which I had never done before, the proclamation, sorry. And not knowing how my board would do, even though we are lucky that our board is diverse in the fact that there is at least one LGBTQ member on it, though this is a fairly conservative county. So I think I timed it well. So I do recommend that it's better to be proactive when you can, because I know some of us didn't get that opportunity. So I took that, and they all voted, even the most conservative of them, for the proclamation. And one of the things I tried to make clear in the proclamation, and also at our last library presentation, because we have to do an annual report to the board, is that the choice of what children read is in the hands of their parents, and that we represent all our community, using terms like that over and over again. But the thing that, as I go out in the community and do speeches and things like that, I am hearing from the community. We just had our book festival, and we heard it during that time too, of how much they support the freedom to read. And even in the most, I was in a room of conservative Rotarians, and when the guys hold up his hand and asked about book bans, and I said, well, this is what we do, gave my little spiel. And he says, good, because I want to read what I want to read. And I'm like, yeah, I want to respect everybody's right to read. So I think by not keeping it, quiet has helped me, even though I'm not shouting it. I'm just letting people know that we protect everyone's right to read. But it can bleed at any time. So that's why I'm glad you guys are doing things like this, and that you're giving us the tools. And I really respect what the libraries who have had more of the confrontation, what they're doing to keep their communities informed. And so I just want to be prepared. So thank you.
Thank you. Joyce has put another resource into the chat for you, United for Libraries Trustee Code of Ethics. She notes that that's another good document to have trustees sign. So if you're looking for that, simply Google United for Libraries Trustee Code. Those of you on the session can see she put the link into it, so you can follow that directly. Before we move into the final segment of our program with you today, are there any other questions you have for the panelists, or things you want to talk about between each other in terms of how to positively react to the kind of challenges we're facing? Joyce.
So in addition to my role with the Freedom to Read Foundation, I am a local public library trustee. And I am in one of the most progressive counties in the United States. It's Cook County. I'm about 20 miles west of Chicago, Illinois. And despite that, we still have a lot of folks showing up at our school board meetings, asking to censor books, etc. And I would just note that I've found education can make such a huge, huge difference with our library board. Every year, those who have just been elected and those who are sitting sign this trustee code of ethics. And some people are like, oh my word, I don't want another training about intellectual freedom. This is a way to not do that. When they read this document, they are getting that education. They're learning, I need to set aside my personal beliefs. I need to uphold my fiduciary duties. It's a very good document about library ethics in general. And I recommend that people focus on that form of education ahead of time, so that regardless of who is getting elected, they're all learning the same information about how to conduct themselves as trustees.
Responses or follow-up comments from anybody else? What are the things that are still in your mind that we haven't covered?
I just kind of wanted to add a little bit to what Joyce said from the, programming librarian perspective, because I think it applies here too. All of our troubles, I think, have largely come from a big, big, big misunderstanding about what a drag story time even is. I think a lot of people that are upset about them have the complete wrong idea about what they even are, what they're for, what goes on at them. So I just wanted to echo what Joyce was saying in that context. And if doing a drag story time is something that you're interested in for your system, and you anticipate that maybe there might be, a lot of pushback about it, perhaps consider, an event prior to that that is more of an education about what a drag story time actually is. And that's something that we haven't gotten to do yet, but that I do certainly want to have at our library, something for adults that's more informational, just, you know, what it is, what it isn't, and what really goes on with drag performers within the library context. And so, yeah, just I think the education on what we're really doing, and what folks think they're so upset about, is going to be super, super, super crucial.
I mean, here I'm preaching to the choir as a trainer. Training has to identify the needs out there and how we can effectively accomplish what we need to do. So you set your goals and objectives at the level Molly has identified them. Say, what gap do we have in messaging out to our audience, and what can we do to bring them up to speed on what we're doing? At the same time, using these, listening to them, so we understand where the disconnect is. It's basic stuff, folks, and it doesn't take a lot, but it definitely does take commitment. Before we do the final exercise that I proposed for today, let me go just slightly off track for something that will be very useful to us at California Library Association. Would each of you please put into chat how you heard about today's program? We're trying to increase our outreach processes at this point. So we're curious, are you hearing about it through CLA? Are you hearing about it through social media? If so, which platform? Just take 30 seconds for everybody to get what source or sources led them to this. Those of you that, okay, several different emails, great. And Karen, if you can copy the chat later, we can go back to this and kind of sort through it. So CLA, I'm not seeing anybody from social media. Anybody getting it from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or any of those platforms? Okay, so one person Instagram, that's great. Facebook and LinkedIn, not so much if I'm reading this correctly. And if you're watching the archive version, if you can send us an email, you can reach me at paul@paulsignorelli.com. If you're watching the archive version, tell us how you found out about that too, because we're trying to pump that up. All right, final exercise for us. Let's make this really have the rubber hit the road here. Two things. Think about a challenge you are currently facing or expect to face. And having done that, jot down some notes to yourself as a first draft action plan, what you will do based on what you heard today to prepare yourself for that or to more effectively deal with the one you're facing. Think about 60 to 90 seconds right now. Time is very roughly. Let's come back and hear a few ideas from people, do some critiques on that. So we all walk out with ideas of how to effectively build on that. Again, think of a challenge you're facing or expect to face and what your few step initial draft action plan would be. Those of you watching the archive version, same invitation. Jot it down for yourself and have that as your action plan when you leave the tape version. Actually, Karen, if you're listening, let's just put it on pause for about a minute because we don't need to make the people watching the archive version sit through a minute of watching us go, oh, we're writing.
Sorry, say that again, please.
Yeah, go ahead and hit pause just for about a minute. I'll tell you when to unpause it so people here live can write stuff.
There you are.
Okay, for those of you watching the archive version, that was about 2 minutes offline where people were just writing things in. One thing that already went in was from Darla, who said she's working on talking to managers about inclusive ongoing programs, not just months. Also working with the board of supervisors and library board to keep aware of these issues. So she's got that action plan. It's exactly in the spirit of what our panelists and presenters today were talking about. And it's an example to the rest of us. If we had not thought to do that, that's a great approach for us to take. That's easy and a beginning point. Anyone else who is a participant in the session today who wants to share the challenge that they're thinking about or facing and what they're doing in terms of an initial action plan?
Well, I think, hi, this is Emery.
Thanks, Emery.
Yeah, I raised the point about elections. With so many people running for office right now, I think it's great to ask candidates how they will support libraries and librarians and how they will use their voices if elected to proactively create these safe and brave spaces, so that isn't on the librarians to do that piece of it, but what will they do to be strong advocates? And I would just encourage everyone to go to their town halls and ask those questions and kind of create a buzz about it.
That brings such a smile to my face, because obviously I've been around a while. I can tell you over decades, I've heard people that are talking to others about how to be good advocates, how to be successful community members, to say, if you want an elected official's attention, the first thing you say is, oh, by the way, I'm watching you, because no elected official wants to think that the people that are watching them are going to walk away very upset. So you let them know you're watching them, you're engaged. That's a way to get attention, be part of the system. Tell me if I'm pronouncing your name right. Shayla?
It's actually just Shala.
Shala. Okay,
Yeah.
Shala, you're up.
So I work in a public middle school library in Palo Alto. I'm on leave right now so that I can get a master's in library science. So I'm learning a lot. Thank you so much. I haven't encountered this in the workforce yet, but I was a Girl Scout and it is honed into my brain. It's just hammered in there. Be prepared. So that's why I'm here. One thing I wanted to mention is that when we have had challenges in our district in the past, it has been a lifesaver to have a very clear process for handling them. And I know that probably 60% of schools do and like 40% don't. So if you don't have a clear process for handling book challenges in your district, it would be great to get that developed.
Wonderful. Thanks, Shala. And best of luck in the MLIS. Hope you complete that work and you join the workforce at an even more effective level than you already have.
I am enjoying it so far, learning a lot. Thank you.
Wonderful. Joyce has got something in the chat about attending AAUW and League of Women Voters programs so you can hear the views of candidates. Again, I know this is not a popular view to take, but actually listening to what people are saying from the other side of whatever political position you're sitting in is so important. I can tell you from going to ALA conferences, local regional conferences, CLA conferences, sometimes you think that everybody in the room's on the same page. But if you listen and you actually have engaged conversations over dinner or in hallways with people, you find out that people you thought were on the same side of the issue you are diametrically opposed, but they're in the same room. And so often what happens is somebody who's in the minority view in some of these organizations goes in with the best of intentions to be part of the conversation. But when they hear that everybody else in the room thinks that everyone's on the same page, it shuts them down. So we sort of miss opportunities there that could help us to be better. I'll tell you, some of my best conversations are with people whose political viewpoints are the opposite of mine, but I love and respect them because they're part of our industry. And I hope that makes me a little better at what I do as an advocate. One more shot. Anybody who came up with a quick action plan? You know, I'm toying with you. I'm going to let the silence go until somebody says, this is so uncomfortable. I guess I better break the silence. Okay, that's where we're at. Final question for today with a reminder, we'll stop the recording right on time. There is one thing I think just came in the chat. To follow what Shala said, our next steps are expanding our challenge process beyond just books and materials. Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. So final question to make sure that this is a session that wasn't just a step away from work and now you're going back to work. As a result of your having been part of this conversation, what's one thing you will do differently in the next week? And what's one thing you're going to do differently in the next week because you're a part of this today? Anyone? Joyce.
I would just ask that each of you please reach out and report any challenges either in your library, your school library, or a community library. If you go to the American Library Association's Office for Intellectual Freedom, click on challenge reporting tool, and it's just the database. You fill it in. It is confidential. If you call us for help, it is confidential. We're glad to talk with you, and the last note reminded me of this. You can report anything. We obviously have had to go beyond, is this a book or an audio book? We're now reporting programming challenges, display disruption. Is this a bomb threat? I mean, the list has grown. So please let us know what's going on in your part of California. We're here to help in any way that we can.
Thank you so much, Joyce. A couple of other things that have come in on the chat. Chris says, going to share the legal definitions with my coworkers at the State Library. And again, remember, these sessions that we're putting up, the archive versions are resources for you to use if they're helpful. Look at part of them, look at all of them together with people, have discussions around them. Shala added, I'm planning to spend time on Unite versus book bans and freedom to read sites to learn appropriate responses to common arguments raised in the book challenges. And Molly's asking, Joyce, could you share a link to where we can report challenges? Well, that's going on. Plug for our next month, second Wednesday of December 2023. We'll be back with a colleague of mine talking about fundraising and advocacy. She's someone who's been involved in fundraising for community groups, nonprofit groups, primarily in California and Seattle. But she's going to be wonderful. So Nanette Fox, I will see you in December. We're already booking in some of the sessions for 2024. If you have ideas, you want us to address things, reach out to me, Paul at paulsignorelli.com, or anybody else on the Ursula Meyer committee, and we hope you'll come back. We'll end the recording in just a second. Those of you that want to stay for a few minutes of unrecorded conversation, you're welcome to do that. I hope you have a wonderful, positive day. Take care, everyone. We can cut the recording now, Karen.